The storm was so loud that I never questioned the noise above me. By the time I realized it wasn't rain hitting the roof, whoever was making it had already been there for hours. I live outside Bozeman, Montana, in a house my grandfather built, the kind with a steep metal roof that turns every storm into a drum solo. That night the forecast had warned of significant rainfall, which in Montana usually means a strong shower and a lot of wind. What actually rolled in over the mountains was something closer to a wall of water, the kind that makes your windows hum in their frames. I was alone. My husband Danny was 3 states away at a welding job in Idaho, and our nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the gravel road. I'd made peace with that distance a long time ago. That night, for the first time, it felt very large. Around 9, I noticed the sound. Not the rain itself, which had settled into a steady roar, but something underneath it, a rhythm that didn't match. Rain doesn't walk, rain doesn't pause, but every few minutes there was a beat that felt deliberate. 4 or 5 soft impacts, then nothing, then 4 or 5 more. I told myself it was a branch. We had an old cottonwood that leaned dangerously close to the roofline, and Danny had been saying for a year we should have it taken down. I pictured a branch scraping the tin, bending under the wind, and I went back to my book. It happened again at 10, then at 10:30. Each time the pattern was the same, a cluster of soft sounds, a long pause, silence. Branches don't pause like that. Branches don't wait. I turned off the television so I could listen properly, which is a strange thing to admit, but I turned off the noise inside my house so I could better hear the noise outside it. The rain filled the silence instantly, but underneath it, I heard the sound move. It shifted from somewhere over the living room to somewhere over the hallway. Whatever was up there was crossing the roof in a straight line, the way a person walks when they know exactly where they're going. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, phone in hand, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Cell service out there is thin at the best of times, and that night I had 1 bar, flickering in and out with the storm. I didn't call anyone. I told myself I'd wait for a break in the rain to check the yard. At 11:40 the power went out, which is common enough during a bad storm, and for a moment the darkness felt almost like relief, like the storm had finally done something ordinary. I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat at the table, and that was when I heard, very clearly, over the rain, a single set of footsteps cross directly above my head and stop. They stopped above the kitchen, above me. I didn't move. I don't know how long I sat there, candle flickering, staring at the ceiling like I could see through it. The rain kept going, relentless, and under it, nothing. No more footsteps. Just the sense, the absolute certainty, that something was listening the same way I was. When the lights came back around midnight, I finally called it in, my voice shaking so badly, the dispatcher had to ask me twice for my address. 2 sheriff's deputies made the drive out in the last of the storm, and one of them, a young guy named Osei, climbed a ladder against the back of the house with a flashlight, while his partner stayed with me. He came down pale. He said there were fresh scuff marks across the tin, boot-shaped, running from the cottonwood tree to a spot directly above the kitchen, where someone had pried up an old vent housing, just enough to see. And maybe here, straight down into my home. They never caught him. What they found later, from a neighbor 2 properties over, was that a man had been evicted from a rental in town 3 weeks earlier. A man who used to do odd roofing jobs for cash. A man who knew which houses in the valley had old vent housings a person could work loose with a flat screwdriver, and patience. The deputies think he was waiting to see if I was really alone before he came down. The storm gave him cover to test it, night after night, house after house, using the rain the way a burglar uses a crowbar, to open something quietly. I sold that house within the year. I still can't sit under a metal roof during a hard rain without listening for the sound underneath it, the one that isn't the storm at all. The first time the lights flickered, I blamed the storm. The 5th time, I realized my house wasn't changing because of the power. It was changing because someone was inside it with me. I was renting a small ranch house outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, the summer I started my new job, and Oklahoma storms in June are not subtle. That night the sky had that greenish weight to it, the kind that makes your ears pop before the thunder even starts. I'd made dinner, put on a show, and settled in for what I assumed would be a loud but ordinary night. The first blackout hit around 8:15. The whole block went dark for maybe 10 seconds before the power snapped back on. Normal enough. I found my phone, checked for updates from the electric company, saw nothing, and went back to the couch. When the lights came back, my throw blanket had slid off the armrest and was pulled on the floor. I didn't think anything of it. Blanket slide. The second blackout came 20 minutes later, longer this time, maybe a full minute. When the lights returned, I noticed the kitchen chair, the one tucked under the table on the left side, was pulled out about 6 inches. I remember standing in the doorway looking at it, running through the day in my head, wondering if I'd bumped it and forgotten. By the third blackout, I'd started to feel the specific kind of unease that comes from doubting your own memory. This time it was the bathroom door, which I always leave open, standing almost closed. I told myself the wind had done it, that a window I'd cracked for the storm smell had created a draft. I went and shut that window myself, hands not quite steady, and stood in the hallway a while longer than I needed to, listening to the house settle around me like it was breathing. I remember thinking absurdly that I should start keeping a mental list. Blanket, chair, door, small things, nothing anyone could call proof of anything. That was the part that scared me most once I understood it later. The smallness was the point. A person can dismiss one strange thing. It takes several, spaced out and precise, before dismissal stops working. The fourth blackout was the longest yet, nearly 3 minutes of total darkness, rain hammering the roof so hard I couldn't hear anything else. When the lights finally stuttered back on, my phone, which I was certain I'd left on the coffee table, was now on the kitchen counter, screen facing down. That was when I stopped telling myself stories about wind and memory. I called my sister, whispering, which felt absurd even as I did it, like I was already accepting there was someone close enough to whisper about. She told me to call the police immediately, and I did, my voice flat and strange in my own ears as I gave the dispatcher my address. The fifth blackout came while I was still on the phone with them. I stayed exactly where I was, in the hallway, back against the wall, phone light aimed at nothing in particular, because I was too afraid to point it anywhere specific. When the power returned this time, the front door, which I had triple-checked was locked before any of this started, stood open about a foot, rain blowing in across the entry rug. The police arrived 9 minutes later, soaked and fast-moving, and found the breaker box on the exterior wall of the house, in the back, tampered with. Someone had rigged it so that a simple touch could trip the whole panel, cutting power to the house at will, without needing a storm to do it for them. The storm was just cover, a reason for the outages to feel natural instead of engineered. They found boot prints in the mud beneath a side window that didn't quite latch. One I hadn't known about, a flaw in a house I'd lived in for 2 months. Whoever it was had been in and out through that window during at least 2 of the blackouts, moving small things, testing how much I'd notice, how long it would take me to break. The detective who worked the case later told me, almost gently, that this wasn't random. It was patient. Someone had wanted to see exactly how a person unravels when the world she trusts, her own home, her own memory, stops being reliable one small detail at a time. They caught him 3 weeks later after a similar pattern turned up 2 towns over. A man with a maintenance background who'd learned how to access breaker panels from outside a house without anyone noticing the tampering. I moved out before my lease was even up. To this day, when the power flickers during a storm, I don't wait for it to come back on. I check the doors first. Then I count the chairs. For 4 hours, a black umbrella stood at the end of my driveway in the middle of a thunderstorm. I thought someone was watching my house. I never imagined the umbrella was only there to make sure I wasn't watching the backyard. I live in a quiet subdivision outside Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of neighborhood where the biggest excitement is usually a deer in someone's tomatoes. That night, a slow-moving storm system parked itself over the mountains and just sat there, hour after hour of steady, driving rain, the kind that turns your yard into a shallow lake. I first noticed the umbrella around 7, when I got up to close the blinds. It was standing perfectly upright at the very end of my driveway, black, ordinary, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. What stopped me was the wind. It was gusting hard enough to bend the young maple in my front yard nearly sideways, and yet that umbrella didn't so much as tremble. Rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that blurs streetlights into smears, and still that single black shape stood exactly where it had been the moment I first looked. I told myself it was wedged in something, caught on a drain grate, weighted down by debris. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting for it to tip or blow away, and it never did. That was the first time I felt the specific chill of realizing something is wrong before you can explain why. By 7:30, I was fairly certain I could see the shape of someone underneath it. A stillness that felt less like an object and more like a person standing very deliberately, very patiently, watching my house. I turned off my porch light so I could see out better without being seen myself, which in hindsight was probably the wrong instinct, but it felt like control in a moment that had none. I called my neighbor Marisol, who has lived 2 doors down for 11 years and has a healthy suspicion of anything unusual. She looked out her own window and confirmed it. A black umbrella, unmoving, at the foot of my driveway. She offered to call the police with me, and I said yes, embarrassed at how relieved that made me feel. For the better part of 2 hours, I did what I imagine most people would do. I watched the front of my house obsessively. I checked the front door lock 3 times. I sat by the living room window with my phone in my hand, ready to call again, entirely convinced that whatever was going to happen would come from that umbrella, from that driveway, from the front. It never occurred to me, not once in those 2 hours, to check the back. The police finally arrived a little after 11, lights cutting through the rain, and the umbrella, predictably, was empty when they reached it. Propped against a homemade wooden stand driven into the soft dirt at the edge of the driveway, weighted at the base with a sandbag. No one had been standing under it in a long time, if anyone ever had at all. What they found next was in my backyard. A section of my privacy fence had been quietly pried open, 2 boards removed and leaned back into place so the gap wouldn't show from a distance. The grass beneath my bedroom window was flattened in a small, deliberate patch, and the screen on that window had been sliced along one seam, carefully, patiently, the kind of cut that takes time and privacy to make. An officer named Ray, who'd worked the area for almost 20 years, told me later that he'd seen this exact setup once before, on the other side of the county. A decoy placed somewhere visible and strange enough to hold a homeowner's full attention, while the actual entry point was worked on unhurried, unseen, from an angle no one thinks to watch. The umbrella wasn't there to threaten me. It was there to occupy me, to make sure my eyes, and Marisol's, and eventually the responding officers, stayed pointed at the one place nothing was ever going to happen. They never found who did it. The sandbag and the wooden stand were generic, sold at every hardware store in the region, and the boot prints in my backyard mud were common enough to be useless. What stayed with me wasn't the fence, or the cut screen, both of which I had repaired within the week. It was the 2 hours I spent, congratulating myself on being vigilant, watching the one thing I was meant to watch, while somebody worked calmly and quietly on the one thing I wasn't. I still close my blinds the moment it starts raining now, and some nights, when the wind picks up, I find myself checking the back door before the front.